Hey guys, welcome to episode 6 of the Help I'm a Camera Nerd podcast, and I'm your host, Anderson, aka Films by AW, and your other host is...
My name's Mark, and I'm Help I'm a Nerd. You can catch me on YouTube. You can see all of our films on YouTube, both mine and Anderson's.
Yes guys, just before I go into, remember to like and subscribe our YouTube channels. That's Films by AW and Help I'm a Camera Nerd. Please, we love the views, but remember to like and subscribe. And you could also follow us on Spotify or on Google or podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, except for Apple Podcasts. We're working on that. We really love to, we love the community we're building, and we love the support, guys. Really appreciate it. This week, we are talking about a very controversial subject within the film industry. Full frame versus Super 35. Is there a difference? Why is it important? Should you be going for Super 35 or should you be going for full frame? We're going to delve into that, guys. So we're going to go straight into it. Full frame comes from the photography point of view, where it's a large format, not quite VistaVision, which is what the cinema terminology for a field of view that was much larger. Because again, these are just talking about sensor sizes, not megapixel, not resolution, the actual size of millimeters of your sensor. So in this instance, I'm just going to open up my exposure because we got caught in that. So in this instance, full frame versus Super 35, it would actually be called full frame versus APS-C, because APS-C was the quote unquote crop sensor size that was that cheaper digital SLRs or SLR cameras would use because it was a smaller sensor size. Obviously there was pros and cons with that, but that's what they would call that sensor size as compared to full frame. But it was and I'd have to double check this, should have done my research, but it actually it was more of a coincidence that it was the same size as the film standard of Super 35, which is Super 35 millimeter film stock. It was, I think, just a coincidence. But because of the 5D generation, that's where the idea of a full frame, a larger sensor format versus Super 35. Now, obviously, it really came from that. And obviously, looking at us, we didn't go to Super 35 cameras. We went straight to, quote unquote, full frame, or slightly smaller than VistaVision size, didn't we?
Yeah, 5D. 5D was full frame, so that would basically mean that you would be, if you were using a full frame lens, you would be getting a bigger field of view. So if you had on...
photography.
So let's say, so you would, let's say 35 millimeter lens on a 5D was closer to what? A 50 millimeter, would you say? Probably a bit wider than a 50 millimeter on something like an APC / Super 35 millimeter sensor.
Yes.
So I remember, obviously you kind of learn your lens sizes, and you're like, oh, a 35 millimeter for that, 24, whatever. But then when I took that step up to a cinema camera, there were no full frame cinema cameras out back then. So you would be getting, your lenses wouldn't give you the same field of view. So you were realizing that, oh, your 50 lens now looks your 50 millimeter lens looks a lot tighter than it did on your 5D, and that it's not just the field of view it affects, it's also the depth of field that it affects, because it's using the edges of the lens, and that gives you the shallower depth of field. Not to say that you can't get a shallow depth of field using an APC sensor, right?
Yeah, that was the thing that really made that stand out. The depth of field. Again, going back to 2008, 2009, 2010 period, there was no affordable Super 35 video or film camera. There was things about creating lens adapters. I think Letus was a big brand back then that created lens adapter that you would put onto your EX3, which had a 1 1/3 inch size sensor that you would then put this lens adapter onto. Then your lens adapter would then essentially magnify that sensor to see a Super 35 size sensor within that sensor. I'm butchering how it's actually the technology works, but it was a hack essentially to create that more depth of field, because depth of field is what we felt associated with Super 35 or Hollywood films. It was having that depth of field, whereas sometimes when you have the smaller sensors, it was more like, oh, that's what they would use on TV or in documentary size. So even like looking at Super 16 is still bigger than a 1/3 size sensor. I think even a 2/3 size sensor, I think it's bigger than. So even with your 16 mil Super 16 documentary film footage, it would have more of a depth of field. But at that time, as indie filmmakers, we were just trying to find a way to make our films look more like the Hollywood films. And depth of field was one way, at that time, we felt it was the easiest way to create that quote unquote Hollywood-like or cinema look. And it really, and again, because it was the one that was affordable, it was one we could get our hands on. That's when we then started learning about, we touched this on our first episode, what different focal lengths mean, how to create depth of field, what aperture went. You weren't really learning that from a fixed lens 2/3 size or 1/3 size sensor camcorder. You weren't really learning that. You were learning, okay, that the servo means going in closer, and then pulling, going back means just having a wider field of view. Whereas being restricted to these different lenses you can put on helped create different looks and ideas. But again, it wasn't even, even like how we think about a 35 lens. Like how we think about a 35 is actually how people in cinema were thinking about a 24 mil. Because for all those years they were using Super 35. So we were learning about this stuff, but it wasn't actually the industry cinema standard, because they were working with a slightly smaller sensor for all those years. So that's, again, another example of how disruptive the 5D was. It just changed our perspective of what these lenses actually mean.
Yeah. And it's still like, Super 35 on cinema cameras, on most cinema cameras, is still, I would say, the standard, right? Still the standard sensor size. I just got a Komodo at the beginning of this year, still Super 35 millimeter sensor. They've not made that jump to full frame yet. And it's only really with like some of the Sony cameras, you've just used one, you're going to talk about that, and the Alexa 35, right? That's got that bigger sensor now. So you're getting slightly more depth of field than you would. But you introduced me to that test. We can link the test in the bio for this. But a really interesting test that showed you the difference that a full frame lens versus the APC, so the equivalent basically. So they set it up so it's the same field of view, so they're trying to match the field of view by using two different lenses, but it shows you what it does to the depth of field. And does that make a difference? Does it enhance the image? What do you think? You've just used the FX6, right, which has a full frame camera sensor. You've actually used a lot of different cameras for this, your latest film that you're working on. Yeah. Tell me about what you think.
Yeah, so, at this point, the film should have been out in the ether for about a week now, so I hope you guys are enjoying it, sharing it, liking it, an ode to fatherhood. There's more interesting content like that coming forward. I think the debate about Super 35 and full frame, for years I couldn't get my head around it. I was like, well, hang on, if you move it further and closer, then you're still able to match the field of view in a different lens. Oh no, there's, some cinematographers will say, oh, there's, the full frame or the or Alexa 65, which is even larger than full frame, and then IMAX, which is even larger than that. Don't get me started on those. But it was like, oh, it creates a different feel. It can mean an emotional thing. There's a slightly different look. People say it's more 3D. Maybe my eyes aren't attuned to it. I can't really see it. Once you match up that field of view, other than depth of field, which is that's the thing that people really wanted from it. Once you match the field of view, I don't think there's much of a difference. The test that Arri put up, it was using their DNA lenses, and they were comparing an Alexa 65 and an Alexa 35. And it was showing you can match it and it looks the same. It's just more of the image that you're getting with the Alexa 65, but the colors and the image itself looks exactly the same. The depth of field had increased, but again, you want the audience to see what you're filming, so you're not going to always want shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field, really, its purpose was, its purpose in cinema. You're really wanting to focus on something or creating a more claustrophobic feel. It wasn't something that was necessarily, oh yeah, we just got to go wide open all the time. And when you think about how we've been using, or how we started out using wide open, films, fast lenses. So by fast, we means the lower the f-stop or the t-stop means the more light that lens is. So we call it a faster lens. We were using that to get an exposure on an image. We were filming with almost no lighting. We're using all practicals or the lighting in the environment. And so we were just trying to get an exposure. So we'd open up to 1.4 just to get the exposure and get that image, be able to see and tell the story of that image. Not necessarily thinking about the emotion that depth of field adds to it. Now, there's a lovely place for that depth of field, but sometimes you don't always want to use it. And that test from Arri really shows it's kind of a fallacy a little bit with it. Now, the relationship between the actor and the camera may change because, again, if you're using a full frame sensor to get the same field of view, so like the reverse works in the reverse very much applies. So if I have a 50 mil lens on a Super 35 and I know the image I want to get with that, if I put the 50 mil on if I like that lens that I'm using on Super 35 and I put it on a full frame, I like the character of that lens. I like the effects that it has and the way the colors render in that image. To match the field of view, I've got to move the camera, the full frame camera, closer to get that same image. So the relationship with your action to the camera changes. So I think it's more of a psychological change a little bit, and obviously depth of field. Now,
yeah,
sorry, that's a roundabout way of going into my segueing into. I just did this project where I used multiple formats. We shot a couple of full frame cameras. We did the FX6, the A7S III, and obviously those are two full frame sensors. And then we also used the Red Komodo and the Blackmagic 6K Pro. And those are two Super 35 sensors. The Komodo sensor is slightly larger than the Blackmagics, but it's they're closer together than it is. Those two sensors are closer in size than the two than they are to the full frame sensors with the A7S and the FX6.
Mm-hmm.
Now, other than depth of field, which I didn't really play with in this film that much, I don't think you can tell the difference that much. These cameras these days, the images are all great. But for me, the benefit of having full frame was having my relationship with the location. Now, I could, without having to go on a fisheye lens, I could then be in a smaller location and get more of a field of view. That's where it changed my relationship with the location and the actors. And I didn't have to go super close to get a different look. That's what I would say the change was. It was more of a psychological change. Obviously, we could go into things like how the sensor renders colors and these sensors, on their looks. And obviously, if you pixel look, you can see the difference. But I think, we've done a good job in matching them together. And it showed to me they're quite interchangeable. It really is about the tool you're most comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched the review edit, and I thought the thing about your film, which was great, is that all of the cameras performed really well. They all looked great. I couldn't really even tell that they were shot on multiple cameras. I think you're spot on. I watched the Oppenheimer behind the scenes video that was released, and they obviously shot on IMAX, which is an even bigger sensor. And they were talking about how the relationship between the camera and the actor has changed because obviously with IMAX, there's a scene of Robert Downey Jr. in the back of a car and he had to have the IMAX camera sat on his lap. That's how close you were getting to the subject. You get really in that, and it's obviously going to make you feel closer as an audience. So it's, and that's really, I think, what has the effect. It's not necessarily the depth of field, because I'm sure there's things you can do in post-production to increase your depth of field and stuff like that. You could mask the subject, you know, blur the background, plenty of that stuff. But having that camera close to you as an actor is going to change things. It's going to change how you feel with the subject. And like you said, the locations as well, being able to get into those smaller locations, you're going to feel that claustrophobia a lot more in the film, right? It's not just behind the camera. It's gonna change your relationship with the actor and the performance and everything. And I guess that's what film originally did, right? Because you had things on stage and you would all go to the theater, but you were never close to the actor. And they always say that Hollywood basically gave birth to the stars, because at that point you were seeing people on a huge screen and you were seeing a close-up of their face.
Yeah.
And it was huge. And it's like, that's what cinema does. It puts these small details in huge format on screen. And I can only imagine how great Oppenheimer's going to look in IMAX, because that's the next level of what we got back then, right? It's seeing those details super close up. And I know the depth of field on like an IMAX camera, I remember for The Dark Knight, I think it's like 2 mil or something, 3 millimeter of focus if you're wide open, which is just kind of insane. But yeah, I think you got it spot on. It changes. It's not about the depth of field as much as it is about the relationship between the distance between the actor and the camera and how that makes the audience feel. Because I don't think the audience necessarily are going to notice that depth of field, but they are going to notice if they feel close to the actor. Because those kinds of things are stuff that you don't need to say. It's just intuitive. The audience are getting that. That's like any audience member's going to get that. If you're watching a film, you're going to know, you're not going to be able to say why you feel like that.
Yeah.
But you will be able to say that you do feel like that. We all could look at a camera lens or an image and say, well, which one of these images do you feel closer to the subject? Is it this 85 millimeter or is it this 14 millimeter? And everyone's going to be able to pick it. They won't know why, but they'll know.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing we always have to remember. Filmmaking is it's an art form. It's not just technical. It's an art form that creates an emotion. Our job is to create emotions in people. One of my favorite films, and I know one of your favorite, it's probably my favorite film, is The Dark Knight. And I wasn't thinking about the IMAX camera. I was thinking about the scene where he's like, he says, 6 years is plenty. I'm going to recite the line now, and Andy Salamanca's going to laugh at me. And it was like, 2 on the roof, 6 shares is plenty. 5 shares is plenty. 6 years. Don't forget the guy who planned the job. What is it? But like, I remember that emotion. I'm not thinking, the IMAX with the depth of field was amazing. I was just thinking about how big the scene felt, how incredible, and the scale of it felt amazing. So that's what I'd say. That's what I really felt from that at the time. So I think people need to just remember that, and we get so caught up in sex specs and whatever else and latest trends that we forget it's about the emotion the audience feels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the audience, I'm not saying that there aren't people out there that know about film, that watch film. Of course there are, but the vast majority of people, they're not technical film people like us. They do not take it for granted, but obviously they just digest it, like without thinking about it, without reading into it. And yeah, like you said, that scene, there's a few scenes in The Dark Knight. Obviously, we're getting films more and more now that are shot entirely on IMAX, but in The Dark Knight, you knew when the IMAX stuff was on because it just felt big. It's like that mask, the Joker holding that mask and that little depth. Like, it's just, you just felt like you were like, that mask was in your face right there.
Yeah.
And it makes you feel differently. And that's really the reason, I think. That's the difference. And yeah, I mean, I guess you can achieve that look. You've just got with a Super 35, you can put a wider lens on and get close and feel that.
Yeah.
But it's making those decisions, I guess, and knowing that and deciding what you want to do. And obviously with full frame, it's going to be more flexible with the locations and stuff, like you said.
Yeah.
So
I think that's the thing, when you're deciding your camera choice, if you have the luxury of choosing different cameras, you have to take your location into account. I think that's what I really learned from this process of using the different camera formats. What is going to allow me to make the most of this location, this actors that I've got, and the camera size was a big part of that. With us as filmmakers, an IMAX camera would be amazing to film on, but it's incredibly large or whatever. Now, if I want a similar look, I know a lot of films are shooting on Venice now. They're shooting on Sony Venice for IMAX because of the large sensor look, and it's they can shoot in a 4:3 to kind of trick the audience it's IMAX, right? But like the thing that would make me say, okay, I want to have a large format look, and why I would shoot in the Venice is because of the rail tow system where I can detach the lens from the camera and have that handheld, or just use an SLR, use an A7S or an FX3 that's going to give me a similar, not exactly the same because you're comparing a sensor that's in a camera worth 80 grand versus one that's worth 3, but like a lot of that views and those angles that I'm able to get with that camera. So I also think the size of the camera, not the sensor size, is more important to your choice of whether you want to use it or not. And I also think that the cameras are just so incredible now, and in the way that these little computers are just processing image data in ways that we couldn't even think of 10 years ago. You're so much more flexible. And I think that's more important to choice, as opposed to, oh, full frame isn't very good. Oh, Super 35 is. Because my other point would be, the films we all love, all of the films we love are shot in Super 35. The whole Dark Knight, my favorite film, it's not all shot in IMAX. Other iconic scenes are not shot in IMAX, they're shot in Super 35. Three perf Super 35. And, my other favorite film, Forrest Gump. I don't care what it's shot on. It's clearly shot Super 35 with Panavision lenses. And again, lenses are what, really help that look. But I don't care what camera it's shot on. But it's not, it's shot on Super 35. And the point I'm making is, we don't go films like that and say, oh, well, it should have been full frame. This doesn't look right. I don't care. I'm thinking about Run, Forrest, Run, or his mom saying, Forrest, I'm dying. That's what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about, oh, well, the depth of field could have been better. Or whatever. It's just like, it's, and I think the other choice, in fact, I'll ask you this question. What are the advantages you feel of Super 35 over so-called full frame?
There's more lens choice, obviously. Like, there's not all lenses. One of my favorite lenses, and this isn't my favorite lens overall, but this is one of my favorite lenses that I own, is the Sigma 18-35. That lens is a fast lens. It's a zoom lens. It covers a decent range from 18-35. It's super flexible. I love that lens. Like, I find myself putting that lens on in a lot of scenarios. That's that wouldn't cover a full frame. In fact, when I put it on my Panasonic camera, it automatically crops the sensor to APC, because that's what, a lot of DSLRs do these days. They'll be flexible. But I love that lens. It's a great lens. So, they're going to be cheaper. Super 30 films, lenses that don't cover full frame, often they're cheaper. So it's going to benefit you budget-wise. I'm not going to say that I'd probably turn a camera down because it's full frame. No, I think full frame, for a lot of us, is a luxury in many cameras. And it maybe will become more of a standard as time goes on. Maybe IMAX will become more of a standard that people outside of cinema can use, but for now, it's not a big enough reason to pick my camera. We talked about picking cameras, and you go through all the different things and you decide what works for you, what's important. And full frame isn't up there on a list in terms of being one of the most important things. There's a lot of other factors that come into a camera that make me decide to choose to shoot on that. And the fact that, like you said, a lot of films are shot on Super 35. The vast majority of them, all the films I love, Back to the Future, like Jurassic Park. Yeah. They all are amazing. They engrossed me. They captivated me. and I wasn't thinking about anything. And I think I think this is why The Dark Knight stands out so much for me, because it came out when we were at uni. I didn't go to that film and analyze it. I went to that film and forgot that I was even sat in the cinema. I think maybe one time throughout the film I was like, oh, I'm in a cinema. And the rest of the time I was totally in. I was engrossed. And that's what film should do, right? It should just get you into it so that you're not even thinking about anything. You're not thinking about what lens was that. Oh, how did they light that scene? I mean, the second viewing, yeah, but the first viewing, I just want to be in. I just want to be like totally engrossed in the film, that I'm not even thinking about real life. Because that's like, for me, what cinema always was about.
Yeah.
As a kid growing up, I watched movies to forget about life, to just kind of get into that world and just be captivated by it. So that's an important thing for me with cinema. And even though I am technical and I love the spec and stuff, it's always the afterthought when I'm working on a film, when I'm making a film. It's, it's using those tools to get people engrossed, to make people forget. And
I think, you make a great point there, because the thing that's also important is we didn't get into cinema because we thought cameras were cool. We got into cinema because we loved the stories. I watched Home Alone with my mom. I watched Born Supremacy. I watched The Lord of the Rings. I watched Jurassic Park, The Matrix. You weren't thinking. The audience isn't thinking about the camera. I know we're the Help I'm a Camera Nerd podcast, but you're thinking about everything in front of it. And obviously, filmmaking isn't just one team. It's a team, an army of people sometimes coming together to bring this idea to life. And I just don't think the size of the sensor really affects that. You could make great films on a 1/3 size set, a 1/3 inch size sensor, or a 2/3 size inch sensor. I think Zodiac was shot on a Sony F900, which was a 2/3 size sensor. Now I know that it was a bit long, but it's a good film,
Yeah.
The Attack of the Clones was shot on, the first film fully shot on digital in 1080p on a 2/3 size sensor. Now people might say Attack of the Clones isn't very good, but they're not. That's not because of the sensor size of the camera. That's because we at the time felt we had expectations that it didn't meet. But I think I always think of what the GOAT cinematographer says. Roger Deakins is like, if you notice what I'm doing, I'm not doing a very good job. Yeah, and it's true.
Yeah,
we're not supposed to. The audience is supposed to go, oh, that's a great shot, or ooh, it's like, no, is the story? Are you immersed in the story? And if you're not, you're thinking like, oh, that shot's mint, and you've missed the key dialogue of the story. Then, well, what's the point? You're just trying to show off your. Do
you know what? Not... It's interesting that you said that, because I think it was a guy who came in to talk to us at film school, and he was working on something. I think he was like the B unit DP for a film that Deakins was working on, and he was super nervous, as you would be, obviously working with Roger Deakins. So he'd set up all these lights and he was trying to look like fancy and stuff, and basically Roger Deakins came in and he was like, what do you think? And he was like, it's good. And he was like, well, what would you do? And Roger Deakins basically just took away most of the lights, and he was like, just keep it simple, And I think that's a really fascinating story that I always remember, because it's like, I think sometimes people get caught up in trying to complicate things, and really you don't always have to do that. You can keep things simple.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, a great message to anyone who's listening to the podcast, maybe to learn. Keeping it simple, man, is just that's what's key to this. To this, obviously you want things to look nice, look consistent. I think it's more important that things look consistent as opposed to looking spectacular. I think a film that looks consistent to the story they're trying to tell is much more important than like, oh, that one shot that looks amazing, And again, you make a point about Super 35. The lens choices. My favorite lens is, the Zeiss Super Speeds Mark IIs. They're Super 35 lenses. Like one reason why I won't go to a full frame camera is because I'm like, well, I won't be able to use those lenses now. And you have hundreds of years worth of amazing glass that have shot the films we all love, and they're Super 35 glass. So I think this flexibility with that format is there. I mean, because again, we shoot full frame, you're kind of limited a little bit to the newer stuff, the newer optics or stills lenses. And stills lenses, you know, they are great, but they have their limitations because they weren't built for motion video, were they? So yeah, some of the advantages I'd say of full frame is the is the lower light sensibility. I do think there's a element, and I think I'm right about the science behind this, where it's not about how many pixels you have in your frame, it's the quality of pixels, which is obviously Arri's argument for the Alexa Classic only being 1080p and not being in 4K yet. It's the quality of pixels. But then also the flip side is the size of your pixel means the noise pattern you see. So when you increase ISO and you're in a low light situation, your noise can become much more noticeable because your camera is on the limit of what it was designed to be optimal, the optimal exposure format for it. So the 5D, we didn't notice this as much. Because the sensor was a full frame, but then the pixels, it had 26 megapixels, which I don't know how to translate that into resolution, but the image was only 1080p, and a lot of that was because it was throwing away pixels or whatever. But you will find the pattern that most full frame cameras are better in low light situations than the Super 35. And the argument against making these high resolution and going to say a 12K camera, which the Ursa 12K is an amazing camera, but it's weak in low light. Now the noise pattern on that, I think they've done some stuff where the noise pattern is a bit different. You don't see it as much because of how they designed it, but it can only go up to like 1600 ISO. Whereas you look at the high resolution, you know, say the Red Raptors or the older Red, say the Epics, they weren't great in low light. You had to give these cameras light. Now, obviously, most DPs will say, well, yeah, just light it. But if you're in a situation where you need that, you know, you're on a little bit of a lower budget, you will tend to go full frame cameras. The Sonys, what you'll find is that their low light capabilities are better, even though they're full frame, but they're still, their resolution isn't very high. I think of the A7Ss, even the FX6, they're still 4K resolution, which you would argue, oh, why haven't you gone up in resolution? But because those pixels are larger, they're able to take more light in. Because it's, you know, because there's less megapixels, i.e. less resolution in a larger space, a larger physical space of that sensor, when it can absorb more of that light and thereby not have as much of those noise patterns. Whereas if you have a smaller sensor and you're jamming more resolution into it, the pixels are much, much, much smaller. So when you then are in situations where it's not an optimal exposure for it, you'll see those noise patterns more. Yeah. And, you know, some people like the noise. Some, you know, this, you know, it's like the idea of when you saw film grain on old Super 35mm film, it was the grain. If you weren't in the optimal situation, they were recovering that exposure to then make it a visible film. But then the problem was you're seeing more of that grain. It's the same kind of philosophy, right? Even though it's a chemical process versus a digital one. Yeah. So that's obviously one of the advantages of full frame. And again, I mentioned the previous one of having, you know, you can have a bit more of a field of view at your locations with the same lenses as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think that, like, it's interesting to me when people say that the camera's not good in low light, because I feel like we've gotten used to, as consumers, basically being able to record in very dark situations. Whereas if you go back to film, you know, if you were shooting on 800 stock, that was probably like the most you could go to. And that, like, to us now is like the standard ISO that on every camera. I mean, most cameras will go much higher than 800. They'll go to like 32,000, 64,000, higher and higher. Yeah. And every time you double the ISO, you're letting in twice the amount of light that you did before. So it's, we're in a luxurious place in terms of when people say, oh, your camera's not very good in low light. I'm like, that's funny to me, because obviously, like, the standard Alexa is, I think, 800 the base ISO. So it's like, it feels like we're in a very luxurious place now. But yeah, that's a different ball game altogether. But yeah,
no, you're right there. I mean, because I was just, you know, when you mentioned the Sonys, that's their MO. They're great in low light.
Yeah.
But like, I think of like the Pocket 6K I have, and I think it's got a dual ISO. So it's got an ISO 400 and then 3200. And he's a Super 35 size sensor. And the low light images look really nice. I think remember to light it. I think it's about the lights you use may need to be smaller, but you still should be lighting your image. You should still, because you want to, again, craft the story. You want the audience to pay attention to the bit you're looking at, not necessarily like, oh my goodness, this whole thing is underlit, or it's so the depth of field is so shallow because of, or compensating because of it's not much light. You want them to be specific. You want to be painting your scene, not just exposing it and getting a regular looking image.
I think you hit the nail on the head.
So I think, I mean, obviously everyone check out that film, An Ode to Fatherhood. It's online. You can share it. Obviously it was about Father's Day, but I think it's a poem that can be, without it. It's just a great message, I feel. Really love
and also,
with Rod Sinclair and the guys on that.
You know what I'd be interested to see? If anyone can spot what cameras were which bits. Which bits of the film were recorded 100%. On what cameras. That would be really intriguing.
I'm really eager to see. Yeah, exactly. Yes. That would be a great test. I'm looking forward to seeing what people think, what these cameras, which did what. Because, it was an interesting experience for me to just use these different formats. And again, it shows what a great time we're in as a filmmaker. I think of Gareth Edwards, and I think obviously he used in Monsters that he shot back in 2010, or it came out in 2010 at least. He shot an EX2 with the lens adapters, and I always go back to that film, and I think, what if we sent some of these cameras back then? What would he think of the options that he has to make that incredible looking film? There is no excuse for filmmakers to say they can't have the right tools to make their movie. Yes, I know we can get caught up in, I think this is a separate debate. I think we're caught up in rig culture, where everyone is they're more concerned about how the camera looks, as in the rigging on it, and it's got this, than the actual image they're shooting, which is insane.
Yeah.
But we've got caught up in that, and we've all been guilty of it. Oh, let me take a picture of the rig. But it's insane because it's like, what about what it's shooting? That's got to look great. And I think the options you have, you have $3,000. You buy a camera that you can shoot your indie film on, over your indie feature or your indie short film, whatever, your documentary. There's so much options out there, and like, don't let the sensor size limit you. Find what you're comfortable with. I'd argue, like we've argued, sensor size doesn't really matter. What matters is you feel comfortable with the tool that you have, and that allows you to tell that story that hasn't been told before.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and it's so weird that you mentioned Monster, because I actually rewatched a trailer for it, because I just the other day, like literally a week ago, I was like, I just want to go back and see if that still looks as good as I remember it looking, knowing that it was shot on a camera that I dislike just because of how much I've used it and how bad the image looked from it, because we didn't obviously do the lens adapters. But I just want to see, and I watched the trailer and I was just blown away by how pretty and beautiful the images are out of it when you've got that lens adapter on. And do you really think Netflix are going to turn down your film if it's not shot on one of their approved cameras, knowing that you can make a great looking image on most things? I mean, we've got luxury now. We've got, and it'd be if you send any of the cameras back to like 1995 or something like that, it would just be insane. Like, what we have now is just amazing, and it's going to get better and better and better as time goes on. I mean, it gets better 100%. Quicker and quicker and quicker these days. I'm sure in 2 years' time there will be cameras that blow me away more so than the ones that blow me away today. So I mean, I've just got RAW enabled on this camera that I'm shooting this on. ProRes RAW is now enabled. You need an Atomos or a Blackmagic video assist, but that's a DSLR that is giving you a RAW output, which is just kind of baffles me. It baffles me that that's even a thing. And it's shocking. It's a great time to make films. And you can even get, even on the iPhone 14, you can get lens adapters that you just put over the front of the lens that can give you really pretty looking images. And most cameras now, I think we're at a time where most phones, even the budget ones these days, have great video like capabilities on them. It's not just even iPhone. So we're in a time where the standard is good. Like no matter what you've got, the standard is probably good. So yeah, you can shoot good looking stuff without all the tech, I'd imagine, these days, and get great looking images. Yeah, it's a good time to be alive.
So guys, there you go. You don't need to worry about all the new tech. Just get something and shoot.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap it up there, guys. We got a little bit longer over our 40-minute mark. So, but we want to thank everyone for joining us and listening in with our pod. You can find us. Remember to like and subscribe. The Help I'm a Camera Nerd podcast. You can find us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, except for Apple Podcasts. We're working on that. But yeah, remember to like and follow our pages, or like and subscribe our YouTube channels. When that's Films by W and Help I'm a Nerd. Looking forward to, seeing the comments, guys. But until then, on the flip side, we see it.
Bye-bye.